Well, thank you for staying, and I'm sure it was the cookies, not the subject, but we'll take all the help we can get. I think the discussions so far have been really interesting, and what we want to do now, and as was pointed out, this is going to be more interactive, and we're going to look for all of you to ask questions and to give us an opportunity to expand on some of the points that my panelists will make. Our topic is really managing middle management development in really a period of cost containment, of many cyclical fluctuations in terms of company performance and their progress and their revenue. And how do we keep that sort of North Star of developing that pipeline of talent? And we have three experts who are going to share their views from the top human resources seat. And we're going to be pulling you in, hopefully, to help us a little bit with some of the questions. First, let me introduce the panel. On my right is Sally Zinovia, who just recently retired, April, from Praxair as the head of human resources after a long career, and now consults with organizations on organizational effectiveness and leadership activities. Next is Mike Dunford, who is the Senior Vice President and the Chief Human Resource Officer for Covidien. You may have seen them in the paper lately. They're doing a little bit going on. Little marriage with a company out in Minneapolis, which could be pretty spectacular. And it sounds like it's going to be a lot of fun. And Dolph Johnson, who's the EVP and the Chief Human Resource Officer of Hasbro. And we're going to have some G.I. Joes later, and we'll let you do some of those. But the nice thing is they all have very global workforces. They have very large workforces and complex businesses. And we're going to understand a little bit how they do some middle management development. But before we do, I just want to offer a couple of thoughts. Some of the things that were reflected in the earlier discussion and some things that I think you should all keep in mind when thinking about developing this really critical mass of leaders in middle management. First of all, most of us in organizations, and I headed human resources at Bristol-Myers Squibb for about 10 years before I became a faculty fellow here and went back to sort of an academic and consulting sort of world. But that middle management group is such an important pipeline. But as you think of our organizations, some of the key trends that we've seen over recent years. One is flattening of organizations. And one of the unintended consequences of that, obviously, is you're squeezing some development opportunities where there used to be more levels of management. Now we have broader spans. And so under the theory of speeding decision-making and flattening organizations, that's taken away a few of the development opportunities. The area of cost management, one thing about going to an executive education program or traveling to different locations, it's very expensive, especially the room and board, the transportation, and doing that. How do we make sure that we're prioritizing and doing that in the right way? The area I spend most of my time in compensation, how do we use the different tools we have in the area of rewards to reinforce development, to retain key people? And as you know, we don't push equity as far down in the organizations anymore as we used to. And so a few of the tools we used to use aren't quite as available. And then finally, that issue of expatriates. And we're going to talk about that a bit because all of our organizations deal with that. The theme of having more local leaders, while at the same time wanting to develop people globally, and that tension between the cost of expatriates, the localization of leadership, how does that really merge with our idea of developing truly global leaders who have had experience outside of their home market? So those are some of the challenges just contextually that I think are important as we go through this. And first thing I want to do is kind of set it up and let each of our panelists tell you a little bit about their company and perhaps a little bit about what they do in terms of developing their middle management talent. And Sally, I'd like to start with you and maybe share a little bit about Praxair.
For those of you not familiar with Praxair, we are part of the chemical space, about a $12 billion business-to-business company, 27,000 employees worldwide, and about 2/3 of those are non-exempt, non-professional employees. So we're really speaking to about 9,000 professionals when we talk about management and people that we would be putting through leadership development type programs. Like any other corporation, we are blessed with budget control situations as we have to deliver to the bottom line for our shareholders. And that has meant that the budget that we've had for leadership development has remained relatively flat over several years. And so that means you have to start thinking about prioritization and have to think about cost cutting and what exactly can we deliver to the organization that is most effective for the most number of people with the least amount of dollars. Okay, so that's probably a good starter for there.
Managing a little on a tight budget there.
Yes, a very tight budget.
Yeah, I've heard of that one.
So thank you. Covidien is about $11 billion medical device company, about 38,000 employees across the globe. We are in the news the last 3 months or so. Medtronic has made a play to acquire Covidien, so we're in integration planning right now. You may know Covidien spun from the Tyco International conglomerate about 7 years ago. We were the healthcare piece. It was actually one of the big arguments to actually break Tyco up was the value that was being withheld in the healthcare piece of it. And the theory was correct. Once we became a standalone publicly traded company, we've experienced some pretty significant growth over the last 7 years. We made a decision early on to invest in the talent. Prior to the spin, we acquired lots of companies, and so in doing so, we acquired lots of talent. So we didn't have a lot of formal talent development programs in place. When we became a standalone company, we realized the need for pipeline and the need to continue to develop people within the Covidien construct. And so we had what's I think led to our success to date is that early buy-in as part of becoming a public company. The leadership stepped up early on, and so the programs I'll talk about today are centrally funded. That way, the business units can't make those target-setting decisions at the risk of actually expending money on the talent development side. Just like Sally, that number, I wouldn't say goes up every year. It's managed very tightly, but we're able to do a lot with a little, and with that executive level buy-in and not having it in the crosshairs of the budget exercise every year has allowed us to really gain some momentum in developing that level of leadership that's so critical to an organization. So I'll share more as we go through, but I think that's a good background.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you, Charlie. It's nice to be here, everyone. I'm Dolph Johnson from Hasbro. Hasbro is about a $4.5 billion company, about 5,200 employees, down from when I joined Hasbro. We were about 12,000, really a company built by acquisition. And I've got a book on my desk that some of you may know, Marshall Goldsmith, and the title of this book is What Got You Here Won't Get You There. And it very much sort of speaks to some of the challenges that we're dealing with now as a company, because we could have continued to be a great toy manufacturer, making great toys and games. I expect most of you, and certainly those with you with kids, have played our toys and games at some point in your life. But I think we've recognized a number of things happening in the marketplace that fundamentally changed sort of the direction we were going to go as a company, starting with, first and foremost, that the consumer was changing, not in an evolutionary way, but truly in a revolutionary way. That consumer no longer wanted to play with our games, our board games, on the living room floor, the kitchen table, but they wanted that play experience, but now in a digital format, in a digital experience. And so we did not have at all the expertise to go pursue that the way we would like, and that's why we've spent a tremendous amount of time now looking for partners to help us in that vein. But at the same time, we saw these big entertainment companies that were going into our space looking for the toy consumer, companies like Disney, companies like Nickelodeon, who said we can go after that same toy consumer, create our same product development division, and we can sort of begin to sort of take on that consumer that heretofore the toy manufacturers like Mattel, Spin Master, and Hasbro had. But we also saw that there was a geographical rebalancing. We just had some fundamental changes in our business. Today, as we look at our business over the next 6-7 years, the real growth of our company is going to come from markets outside the U.S. And it's also posed some very interesting challenges for us in terms of how do we develop talent, because today the fundamental challenge we have is how do we get the programs that we thought worked and get those sort of transported into markets outside the U.S., but not do that assuming that those programs are not going to have to change to be culturally relevant, to make sure they're specific to the kinds of markets that we're trying to grow our talent, and to make sure that markets that today where we see the biggest growth, markets like Russia and China and Brazil, that have a lot of our population, that we continue to invest in those people. And the challenge we have is so many of those people have only been with our company 2 to 3 years. And so part of what we're trying to do is, first of all, do we even know who that talent is? We've hired a lot of people, but trying to get our hands around who really that middle-level talent is and where we want to invest has been a real challenge for us, and we'll talk more about that as we go forward.
Maybe, and I'll stick with you for a second, Dolph. Share with us a little bit about how you go about prioritizing, because if you have those emerging markets, different markets you're going into, I imagine you have a limited pool that you're spending. What's sort of the prioritization model that you go through in deciding what programs you're going to pursue, what geographies, and for whom?
Well, here's the challenge that we're dealing with now is part of what we had was sort of a two-pronged approach to how do we sort of go develop some of these markets, particularly markets outside the U.S. We started first and foremost with this top talent strategy. So we established a talent advisory committee, and these were all of our key sort of senior leaders in the business. So our chief development officer, our chief marketing officer, myself, and a couple of others. And we started our focus on who are the top 50 people in this company that are going to fundamentally change and lead big parts of our business. Now that's one strategy to take, but it does that at the expense of what you're doing now with all your middle-level management talent. Because again, we only had so much points of focus. We only had so many resources to put against it. And we engaged at that time TUC. So TUC for years has been our sort of global leadership program, bringing in all of this top talent from outside the globe into Dartmouth, where we spent weeks at a time working with these groups on a variety of different leadership objectives. The other thing that we had spent a lot of time on is in talent acquisition and trying to become far more sophisticated with respect to trying to find talent in markets outside the U.S., engaging with companies. Many of you are familiar with companies like Spencer Stewart, who help us come in and set up the kinds of assessments, developing assessment centers in market so that we could make sure that we were developing and assessing the kind of talent that would grow with our company. But again, part of what we're now dealing with is we've left a bit of a vacuum with all of this middle-level talent, and now that's what we're doing to try to catch up, to get those people ready to take on some of these big leadership positions. Because what we're finding is the nature of our business changes. We need leadership in people who can start up a business, people who can scale up a business, people who can turn around a business. And so they require different leadership attributes. And we're now going back with this middle-level management group, recognizing that we've got to find those people, identify and assess those capabilities to marry to some of the key markets that we need for growth.
My personal experience, what I've observed in organizations, it's easy to make sure you're developing that sort of high potential and top tier, and often it gets crowded out as you go down in terms of budget. Now, Mike, you said you manage the funding of the development program centrally, which is different than my experience, maybe different than our other participants. Tell me how you make sure that spend goes where you want it to go, especially at the middle management level.
Yeah, I mean, so just as Dolph did, we prioritized first. So right out of the gate, we tackled the executive level, so the successors to the C-suite and the business group leaders, and then very quickly targeted that middle group. And they're global programs, so we don't make decisions around geography or business unit. We make it at the Covidian enterprise-wide level, and we run a global program that's funded from the center. And when we put the cohorts together, we look for that max mix. We look for across gender and cultural difference and geography and function, so that when the groups come together, a cohort of 25 comes together, there's this value of learning from each other as well, about, what does a supply chain guy do so that the salesperson can appreciate that and so forth. So that's really keeping it global and keeping it at the center. The prioritization discussion is, can we run 2 this year or 3 this year?
Okay.
And that takes us to the budget piece. We always run at least a couple.
So it's really timing and metering out
It
who
is.
gets to go when.
Exactly, and it's become the kind of program that's highly sought, and so and that's what we were hoping for.
Sally, in terms of your budgeting, I know you've had very strict management of it, and does that crowd out the middle manager? How do you work with that?
It actually doesn't. Very similar to what Mike said, we do prioritization of who comes, and it tends to be your top talent that is selected to come to the centrally managed leadership development courses. We actually have we've maintained that budget, and we've maintained the participants pretty tightly. as far as who can come and who's nominated to come to that. But in addition to that, our business units do step up and have their own set of leadership development issues that they then do invest in their organization. So maybe a different level of training or a different type of training that's complementary to the global training that courses that we put together. In addition to that, though, because you mentioned something that's kind of interesting, our management team, our senior management team, was always concerned about focusing too much on just the high potentials, and I'm leaving behind all of my, I think it was called pillars earlier today, right? I'm leaving behind my high performers in the organization, and we did not want to get the high performers lost in this shuffle. So we took part of our budget and invested in things like e-learning applications. So that was open to everybody, and we made sure that some of those courses were available in multiple languages so that our cohorts around the globe could participate. And then we also did some things that were just plain free, such as we put out a little training newsletter once, maybe every 6 to 12 weeks, depending on how often we got to it. There was no schedule. That was kind of a one-page reminder around a particular topic, and it became like a little mini course almost of, listening skills. And we might put 8 or 10 bullets down. It's tips. It was tips, but it stemmed from our global survey. What came back from our employees, they were saying our managers aren't really good at managing. And so we were trying to focus on that mid-management tier and get their management skills.
You mentioned online. You all have geographically dispersed people. How much do you use online technology, distributed learning, as opposed to the Dartmouth program of bringing people in? I'm sorry, David, Dartmouth, but bringing people to a location. How do you manage the logistics of people who you do want to have development, but you don't want to spend that money? Maybe I'll start with you, Mike.
Sure. I mean, they're absolutely, that's a fundamental cost, and that's the piece that we do leave in the business. So once we select somebody, the business supports them, the care and feeding, if you will, the hotel and the flight and all of that. And,
okay.
And then the center pays for the location we run the program. We do e-learning, and that's scattered throughout the organization. 38,000 people. We probably have anywhere from 6,000 to 7,000 employees participating in some e-learning course, at any given time. But we find we run the cohort we're talking about, this middle manager tier. We run 3 sessions for the program. 1 in the U.S. and 2 outside the U.S., 1 in an emerging market and 1 in a developed market. So by design, we bring a bunch of people to Sao Paulo in Brazil, or we bring them over to Shanghai, Istanbul, Turkey, and a number of other places, in addition to a developed market, where we do business, so that they get exposed to our business in that market in the context of the program. And it's part of the expense, but it is spread across the organization. That's the piece that the business will pay for.
Dolph, I think you do some things more out in the market too. What sort of things are you doing?
Yeah. It's in fact it's very similar to what Mike had just described. I think, in fact, it's in response to the fact that we have a broad learning management system, which I found to be marginally effective. We found, in terms of utilization, we had a fair number of people that would come into the system. They didn't find it particularly effective, and you could see that the depth of bench didn't fundamentally change when we put it in place. So part of what we had recognized was that for us to really develop this middle management sort of cadre of talent, the thing that we kept hearing time and time again from everyone was how important sort of being in the business was. And we were so geographically dispersed that it was important for us to start to bring this group together. And the way we built that was a bit of like apprentice and survivor had sort of come together. We called it our high performance leadership program, and it's probably been now our flagship program. So we've moved away from Tuck, we've moved away from Dartmouth, and now what we do is we bring in, we try to do it a couple of times a year, 16 of our high potential but mid-level management people. So these are people really for us at our director level. And just to put that in context, these are people that are $140,000, $150,000 base salary. Manager of managers, just to give, again, for context. So, for example, I took a group to Moscow because we were coming into the to the Russian business, and we wanted to go build a business plan. We felt like what better way to do that than bring people into this market. We basically had two groups of 8, and again, we sort of gave them tasks about how do we go build a business plan, how do we come into this market and do it so that they could learn that, develop the global mindset. We have a number of partners like EA that were already there, but how do we do this in such a way that we avoided perhaps some of the concerns around some of the ethical issues? How do we make sure we understand the retail base, the consumer base? But we had two groups of people over there for almost 10 days working 18-hour days, helping build a business plan. They then came together. We spent a couple of days in Moscow working with them through it. They brought that presentation back to our CEO, CFO, and COO to present the business plan. And we've done that now in Dubai, in Romania, in Bulgaria, and just as Mike said, in other developed markets as well. But we found bringing that group together to sort of put them in the market, to work on different aspects of that marketplace, has been probably our most effective way of developing talent.
Sounds pretty powerful, and then to bring it back, and of course it's a form of a leadership review when they're presenting it, and you're understanding a little more about the talent you have in sort of a review sort of concept.
Right. And again, part of it was also in reaction to the fact that despite the fact that we would like more expats, we as a company actually have very few in the context of 5,200 employees. What we're finding is most people, particularly at middle management ranks with families, don't want to go do that. That's been more our experiences. They'd love to go do that on a project basis, but to find the kind of critical mass of people who want to do that on a broad scale basis has been a real challenge for us. So we have to look for action learning projects in a way to get them steeped in a market and outside the U.S. And that's been, again, a valuable part of that experience.
The session before us talked about the 70-20-10 in terms of sort of jobs and mentoring and informal or internal or external development. One thing that triggered a thought for me was, in addition to that, is how do you use your own leadership as teachers within your programs? I think you mentioned sort of bring these people together. You were personally there. Sally, in terms of engaging your management team and helping to develop those middle managers, what sort of things did you all do?
Well, certainly they become some of our instructors in some of our courses. But in addition to that, we have, I can't call it a mentor, but we've asked for sponsorship of some of our high potential folks that are in the middle. Again, it's unfortunately we are focusing on the high potentials more than across the board to take the executive level time. Anyways, but as we go deeper into the organization, we really have been working. We're a highly technical organization, strong engineering organization, and we are faced, like many organizations today, with an aging population. So we are concerned about the fact that our technical expertise may decline as we see some retirements bump up here too. So we've been doing an awful lot of work on knowledge transfer.
Which is another form of development, obviously.
Which is another development thing. And one of the things that we've liked to say to people is it's not just the knowledge transfer in the technical sense. We need you to give your wisdom to the people that you're talking to, which means help them with how you've accumulated judgment around a topic as opposed to just technical knowledge around a topic.
Developing perspective, yeah.
Right. And that's come off extremely well, especially in our engineering communities. We have communities of practice that are, process engineering, or it might be mechanical design or whatever, that are global.
Good one. Mike, use of faculty in terms of leadership?
So in these cohorts I described, each group of 5 participants has an executive coach.
Okay.
And the output of the program is an action learning project. So the third session, the final session, is held in the U.S. Myself, my peers, the leaders of the different businesses participate in the audience. But the coach takes the cohort participants through their projects. They all have projects through the course of the program. And they play a kind of a critical role helping assess the focus of the project, what the project is expected to do, and really push back. And we actually use that coaching role in the development of that level of vice president in our organization. So we'll say to somebody, it would be really good for you at this cohort to be a coach. This is going to help you be a better whatever it is you do. And so that's been pretty effective for us. Yeah.
One thing we did at Bristol Myers Squibb, which was interesting, we had a program called Leaders Developing Leaders. We started with the top 15 people and had myself and a vice chairman teach them how to be leaders for a day. So you can imagine the CEO and the general counsel, and they were telling them how to be leaders. That was interesting. Then we paired them up, and they would go in twos and go teach the next level of leadership. And then they would pair up in groups of two and go down. We pushed it all the way down where secretaries, administrative assistants were pairing up and teaching other administrative assistants how to be leaders. What does it mean to have a good meeting? What does it mean to really be an effective manager of your boss's time? Things like that. What's leadership in every job? And we found, not exactly on a shoestring, because you take the opportunity to cost those people's time. But one thing, and I'm just building on your thought, what we found the most effective thing is when leaders are out teaching other people, they start to be better leaders because they don't want to be hypocrites. Because they're out there talking about what you're supposed to do and feedback and modeling and all that, and they're in front of 30 people, so they go back to their office and they're saying, well, I guess I better do that. So it's not a bad model. And it's also probably cheaper than going to Harvard, or not cheaper than David's, but it's cheaper than going to some places. One thing about that 70-20-10 sort of thing is most jobs tend to have incumbents. Sometimes you get turnover, sometimes you get retirement. And some of those jobs are really great development opportunities for someone, but someone's sitting in that job. How do you manage that? I mean, assume the person's not failing because they would be gone anyways. How do you make sure that you manage the movement of people through developmental opportunities in a way that's viewed as fair in the organization, but at the same time, you're not waiting 5 years for someone to retire? Maybe, Sally, how do you all do that?
First, I would say that I think every organization has a culture. Our culture tends to be probably believing that 90% of development comes from a job. So
probably not far off, by the way.
Yeah, I think it's highly dependent. We're an operational company, right? We love our operators. And so we really do need to do movement around the organization. And as you downsize, as you know, there's less and less opportunities. And a great example, there was a point in time where if you had not stepped into a product management role, you probably were not going to go up the pyramid at all. And those number of product management slots probably declined from about 12 to 4, okay, over time, as we delayered the organization and started pressing for costs out of the organization. What I was able to manage to do is have the dialogue with our senior team saying we really do need to put some of these training slots back in because we've lost the path. We lost the places where people learn the most. And I did get some ability to do that. It's actually, if you think about it, it's somewhat of a cheaper solution than actually having another training course or whatever. Put another slot back in here, we can move some people through it. It just broadens the opportunity for a job-related experience. And so that actually had resonated with our organization a bit.
Good way to do it, yeah.
Another thing we did was we looked at jobs that there were multiples of. So things like a district sales manager or one of our store managers, and said, there's a need to keep some of those incumbents in place because that's the
continuity.
Yeah, that's the continuity of the organization. But let's make sure that there's a couple of those slots that are a little bit more rotational, that we churn a little bit. And they may be safer places where it's hard to kill the business, right, too?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Delphi, how about your world? How did you manage that? Especially some of your locations, maybe with 5,200 people, there aren't that many jobs for development.
Well, I think the first thing we did is we had to deal with an issue that we had in the U.S. because the U.S. was a problem for us in the sense that we had, at my director level, my average tenure was almost 15 years. So I had a lot of people that you could argue were sort of blocking some of those opportunities. And some were very, very good, very talented, but that's as far as they wanted to go. And so we did something we'd never done before, which was we actually went in and created a voluntary retirement plan. We ended up, we've always been concerned about that because, A, you're afraid how many of your good people will take it.
And they come back as consultants, but yeah.
But in any event, we had nearly 170 people leave the organization just through that plan, which created in the U.S. Any number of opportunities. Outside the U.S., it has been a bit more challenging. One of the things that we do, though, is we try to set aside a bit of money in our budget just to create some new jobs. We may call it a category manager job, where we may say that for our marketing person in Shanghai, we want that person also to be the category manager for our boys business for all of Asia Pacific. So we expand that person's role, and there's always this debate with, do you give that person a bump in salary, knowing that they may come out of that? But be that as it may, one of the things that we've tried to do is be somewhat creative with respect to some of these opportunities across some of these smaller markets where we have that. So that's how we.
That's an important, jobs and structures are artificial constructs. I mean, you kind of make it up. Most organizations do, so you make them up for development. Mike, your experience.
I think what Sally did is probably closest to what we've done, where in the midst of org design or organizational structure changes, we're much better now than we certainly were 7 years ago about looking at that exercise with talent development in mind. So not cutting to the bone when we know we could probably leave a couple of positions and recognize that they can be pass-throughs, development opportunities for people. So that's probably helped us avoid what we used to do, was the very difficult conversations with the long-tenured employee. And we've had our fair share of those as we have grown and contracted, acquired and divested over the past several years. This notion of setting it aside in the organizational structure on the front end has helped us in that regard. You can keep the highly valued.
Yeah, it's so hard in your sort of organizational justice to have someone who's done a good job, all of a sudden you tell them you're a blocker, you got to go, sort of thing. By the way, questions, we'll take them at any time. I know if anything comes up as we're going through this. Yes?
Quick question. This is one that I'm facing in North America. Now, my company is a global company. It's 300,000. And obviously, we'll be speaking here, I believe, tomorrow a couple of times. But one of the ones that I found most challenging for me is integrating the hypos out of the functional and horizontal groups within my organization into the business hypos. So there's a smaller number, obviously, whether they're in a hypo. How are you creating a path for them in this talent development pool, and what's the carrot for them? It's not like an HR manager is going to become an operational manager, at least not successfully.
Yeah.
And there was a point brought up in one of the earlier discussions about when do you do that, and when is the opportunity to make those kinds of moves. And we're starting to recognize that. We're not by any stretch doing it well, but the earlier folks are in their career, the easier it is to kind of do that, whether you're taking a finance person and maybe moving them into a commercial organization in a commercial role, so that they're better prepared for the bigger jobs as they move up. But that's an absolute challenge that we continue to deal with, is that cross-functional from the function into the business. I don't have it cracked yet, but we have a few wins, and we brag about those, and we're always looking for the other opportunities.
Just on that, Dolph, you had mentioned that you were having trouble with Americans moving outside of the U.S. to take opportunity?
Yes.
Is that what I understood?
Yeah.
Yeah,
that's
we're
been.
facing the same thing, and we were taking from an HR or talent development, horizontal groups, taking them and see if they would go for international assignments 6 months, 9 months.
Well, it's interesting because we probably had more success in the HR group because we have a number of young folks who are reasonably early in their career. They don't have.
HR is a little bit more universal.
We have shortened the terms, so instead of the 2 to 3 year expat assignment, we now have 3 month, 6 month assignments, and that's helping us get more takers, and it's easier for folks to accommodate.
It begs the question on both of the points you raise is, what is it specifically you're looking for someone to learn? And where can they learn it? Do they have to go for a 2-year expat assignment with all the money and the compounding of expense, especially if they have family, dual career? In the cost-cutting environment. Yeah. Secondly, as an example, moving into a line function, what is it that they're going to learn in the line? And how can you get that either by partnering with someone on a key initiative like you're doing in Russia, which I found fascinating. That would be a great one for a staff person to go in and see what the business, how you build it, the contextual concerns and stuff. So One thing that I always encourage companies to do is we always describe jobs in terms of responsibilities and deliverables and scope and things, to add at the bottom, what does someone learn by taking this job? Is a descriptor of a position. Then you can start thinking a development path, where are those opportunities to learn what you think the void is, as opposed to just they need this job. A different way of thinking about it. Someone else had a question? Yes, sir.
Isn't there a limit to what headquarter high potential folks can do?
Yeah.
Are you really investing enough in developing local talents?
Yeah, so I think that gets back to the local versus importing talent into the market. All of you, you're expand?
And I want to make sure that our semantics are right, because when I say high potential, it's not U.S.-based high potential talent. All of our training programs, all of our global development programs are hypos that have been vetted
Yes.
from the organization that are coming from Brazil or China or India or whatever. And that's actually part of the learning that takes place in any of our combined coursework, is that networking that occurs and that cross-cultural understanding that occurs. So it's not a U.S.-based line only up, it's actually global for us.
Are the
Oh, same,
requirements
yeah.
for the high potentials for the United States and high potentials at local?
Is
The definition of what a high potential is?
Yeah, well, yes. Yes.
Sorta.
Kind
No.
of, sort of. Yes, in that we try to have the HR community vet the lists. Now, like any lists that come up from an organization, there may be disputes as to whether they really truly meet the same standard, but so you're off a little. You know, eventually it comes out in
Sure.
performance, and it comes out in who gets whatever jobs are available.
It's really a great question. It's really something we've wrestled with. So 3 years ago is when we really started to put focus, and we sat at length with our compensation committee, because we also had to realign compensation to address this group. Because we had always, at Hasbro, we've always been somewhat of a company that we wanted to treat everybody exactly the same. That was sort of this paternalistic approach, this mindset that we had. Recognized that was not good enough to not only attract talent, but to keep talent. So we started to create a bit of this meritocracy, which was a bit sort of against our cultural sort of mores, because a lot of people say, well, wait a minute, well, you can't have the haves and the have-nots. That's completely not what Hasbro's mentality should be. And we've had a lot of discussions around that. I had sort of thrown out a number to the HR team and to the leadership team to say, I think when we talk about a company our size, that if I could get 50 to 75 individuals that could probably go, again, put a stake in the ground, another 2 levels in this company, people that we're building the organization around, and that was kind of a broad phrase, but that's how we started to define our high potential talent. And sort of the first pass was very different than 18 months ago. In fact, I would argue that we probably had 60% turn in who was on that list at the beginning, and now who's on that list. And again, that's created some different conversations about how people sort of get on that list, the framework that we use to sort of develop them, and then how they stay on that list. And then paying those people has been also a bit of a challenge, because you start to say, we want to treat the people that are on this list, we're going to pay them at the 75th percentile of the marketplace. We're not going to pay them at the median, which is philosophically where we've been with the rest of our people. And those are things that we do. We have to take to the comp committee, because that's a different spin, it's a different look. We need comp committee's blessing on different equity plans that we put in place for them that we've never had for the rest of the organization. So it's been a very, very much a work in progress with respect to that.
I think your question's interesting too, though, and I hadn't really thought of it before now, in that there are people that can assume a place of leadership, let's say for South America. But if that person is going to be the president of South America, and by virtue of that position needs to be interactive with the board of directors and needs to be interactive with some of our global leadership in, let's say, R&D or whatever, there may be a different set of competencies that's needed to actually assume that particular position than maybe the next level down of leadership. And I can think of, for example, one of our best people in Brazil does not speak English. And so for him to actually assume the presidency of Brazil, it's not going to happen. because he's got to be in a situation where he can speak English at least fluently enough to participate on the teams that he has to participate on.
You know, I've had two CEOs, one an American and my current CEO is Brazilian. And so if I took the list from 4 years ago and compared it to the list today, dramatically different. So the perspective that the Brazilian CEO brings to talent has globalized us, you know, in an incredible way. Yeah. So I'm a proponent to look at the leadership teams at the regional and business level and look at the composition of those teams, you know, and look at that routinely so that we can actually start to make a shift because it's important.
Other questions? Yes.
So I have two questions. They're kind of separate. So my first is I wonder if any of your leadership training involves activity outside of your company. So, for example, getting together with your CSR people and sending people to build houses and stuff. Oh, thanks. And how that, if you've done that, how that's impacted your leadership development and identification of high potentials. And then my second question has to do with your organization's values and how those values are kept in mind or reflected in the people that you choose to bring up through the organization. I was having a conversation with two other attendees earlier this afternoon, and we talked about in some organizations, perhaps not yours, but some, there's a disparity between what people say constitutes a leader and a high potential, and then who people actually see are being risen up the ranks. And I wonder how you address if you've ever felt that disconnect. Thanks.
Great question. By the way, at GE, we used to have a phrase for people who would kiss up and kick down. They were high potentials in quotes, but yeah. The first question, how do you use non-corporate experience, perhaps, those outside? By the way, I have to do a plug for Paula's volunteer work, by the way. It is an awesome way to get people involved in non-corporate, you're in your own corporation, but have a wonderful accelerated learning opportunity. But having said that, how have you all done it?
Just a couple of ways. One of which is still more in a corporate environment. So in our European operation, which is based out of London, we have a program there called our Circle program. And so there are a lot of companies that they bring senior executives, we bring senior executives, and we actually share some of the executive experiences working on different projects in different companies. And there's a group of 25 of those that we sort of move in and out of that process to say sometimes it's better to have something, if you're working on something outside of Hasbro, can you have more learning from working with another company on a certain project?
Non-competitors, obviously, yeah.
And we've had some moderate success with that. I think to your second question about values, I would argue that probably more people fall off our high potential list because of their value system is different than not in terms of what we're trying to aspire to. I think our value system is something that all of our senior executives embrace. We have clearly high potential people who it's all about the what, and when you start talking about the how, Charlie, to your point, there is a gap, there is a disconnect, and a number of those people that you would look at in terms of performance have come off of that list. And we've had to sort of come in and intervene and try to do some pretty intensive coaching with people because the how was really sort of against what our value system was. The other place that I would argue from a leadership standpoint that we've tried to develop a lot of people, we've had great success, is at Hasbro very much one of the value propositions we have is our philanthropic efforts. Sort of making the world smile is kind of a theme that we have in giving back. And all over the world, we try to support volunteerism. And we actually look for people to lead specific projects in a lot of different markets with our big philanthropic partners. Give Kids the World, make all of these different organizations. So there are a lot of people who want to get involved in leading some of those organizations and playing a significant role. And it's, from a volunteer standpoint, it's been a terrific way to develop leadership.
Sally, I know you've been involved in that a lot, right?
Yeah, we actually have, anytime we have a group training session or, let's say, a leadership conference or whatever, we put a component of community service into it. So it could be off-site community service. It could be something that we do at one event. I can remember we kind of sewed some dolls that were for our Mexican organization to give out to an orphanage. So it's all over the map, the type of community service, but we have been adding that as a component for any large gathering we might have of our folks. In terms of the value system, one of the interesting conversations, my CEO is very, very clear that anyone who does not meet the requirements of what he calls the table stakes of safety, ethics, diversity, he doesn't want to see on the list. And so it's very clear, and it's to the point where it sets over here before, and if you don't get past that screen,
No discussion.
there's no discussion about furthering a career.
Mike, how do you handle that
Yeah, I
sort
mean,
of?
on the philanthropy side, we do it through projects. It's not an integral part of the leadership development program, but leaders take responsibility to do, Habitat for Humanity. We do some stuff in Haiti, all over the world, really, in different places. On the values side, one of our values is collaboration, and so we really drive that through the course content. Another value is diversity, and we use that as the lens when we look at who attends and who participates, so that and I said this earlier, this notion of max mix, so that you can really look across function and geography and experience and in thought and just bring the most diverse group together in these cohorts, because we see the power that brings to the learning for those from different parts of the world. So.
Yeah, it's interesting that in many different cultures, when we would loan an executive or a fairly senior director to United Way or something, that was kiss of death.
Yeah.
That was, you wanted someone out of the way. So you have to make sure in terms of the messages around those sort of external things that it's not confused. We often use that as a way to have someone sort of creative outplacement, and you want to be real careful of that sort of stigma around it. But one thing I want to get back to, and maybe it gets underneath some of the questions. Corporate can do so much when it comes to talent, identifying high potentials, all those sort of things. Mike, you talked about you were in an acquisition mode, so development really, you were acquiring rather than developing a lot of your talent. What do you do to really drive that development mentality throughout the management ranks? How do you do that?
For us, it's been something that's happened over time with the senior team. So as the senior team has gotten together, probably in the last 2 years, there's a real ownership for the talent agenda. We talk in terms now of pivotal roles within the organization, and we look at the bench depth of those pivotal roles. And the senior team has taken on the responsibility that they own that bench now. And so
For those pivotal
for
roles.
the pivotal roles. But if you think about it, if the pivotal role is your, controller, let's say, you have to look deep in the finance
Sure.
organization to see who's in the queue for that, or pick a general manager role. So it engages them in the importance, and they own that. And I think that's helped us quite a bit. So when we say to them, we got to take this person away from you for 3 weeks, a month, or whatever it is, or there's a 3-month assignment over here they have to go to. And look what that will do for them up here.
Mm-hmm.
It closes that argument for them. And
So it becomes sort of development to what?
exactly. And we answer that what question, and then we identify the pool that we're drawing from. So
Off driving that sort of mentality. I know you've worked in PepsiCo and others where, it was sort of in the DNA. How do you help drive that through your organization?
Well, we started with just our board of directors requires me every July. We have a 3-day strategy session, and in that strategy session, I have to do at least an hour and a half of succession for the board that takes us down pretty deep in the organization.
Okay.
And at various points in time, what we'll do is we'll invite teams. For example, at our most recent retreat, we had our Asia Pacific leadership team come in and did not unlike what they're doing here this afternoon, is a bit of a panel, and they'll talk about things like leadership. because we want to get a sense of their value system. We want to get a sense of what their capabilities are to take on bigger roles. But we also want to expose them to the board. So I'll spend a lot of time with our board of directors talking specifically about leadership succession. And it's more than just, what happens if the CEO gets hit by a bus scenario. We really try to spend time talking about it. But we've also said we want a talent advisory committee. So again, as I alluded to earlier, this is our senior most leadership team who's involved, so that if we're thinking about programmatic things that we want to do corporately, and so the HR group, we have some ideas, I want to take that back to this talent advisory committee to get their blessing, to get their input, to get their understanding of, is this the right program for what we want to go do? Because we're trying to do less training and more development. And that's really a blended learning approach. So it's less about classroom, it's more about how do we take the classroom as a precursor to action learning, to mentoring.
More about you.
It's more about you, right? So we're trying to put all of those pieces together because we do a lot of training. I don't think the training is that effective. And it's less effective even outside the U.S. because we're trying to figure out, does that program even make sense to the people we're trying to train? Are those elements still relevant for what we're trying to do? And mentoring for us has been, aside from the high performance leadership, the mentoring program we've done has been a phenomenal success. If there's a group we use out of Minneapolis called Mentium, who does tremendous work in this space, And it's something we're trying to make now a global program. It's a bit more challenged logistically because in so many of these markets it's virtual and it doesn't work quite so well. But nonetheless, if there's a mentoring opportunity in your company, I would highly recommend it because it's been, particularly at the middle level management group, it's been an astounding success for us.
The dilemma, we're talking about middle managers. It's development, that pipeline, which is, that's where the pyramid starts getting wider than talking about the senior team or even the high potentials. How do you define the relative roles of corporate versus local? Who does corporate own? Who does local own? How do you make sure that sort of is seamless in terms of development so there isn't this gap between the high potentials and the senior people and then sort of the big mass? Sally?
Okay, if we were to take Praxair's pyramid and say there's probably 125, 150 people on up at the most senior management levels, that would be what the CEO
You own
and
them.
his executive team owns. The next layer down, which is probably about 700 to 1,000 folks, managers, we corporate would own the high potentials that come out of that group. Now, many of those folks are senior leaders within a divisional area, and that is owned by the division to do any kind of ongoing.
So it'd be sort of a joint ownership of them.
Now, that being said, once a year, the CEO sits with each of the division leaders and looks at the succession plan for that division, and you have a conversation of, who's in the pipeline as far back as 5 years in the pipeline. And so the familiarity with those names and what is happening from a developmental standpoint begins to have, you
It's
begin
like
to
your
have a
pivotal role.
conversation,
Yeah.
with the CEO. And so he starts to hear the names, and when it's time for job changes and so forth, it does come into play.
Okay,
So-
yeah. Leadership reviews, how far down do you go to make sure development's taking place so you understand that sort of pipeline? Give us sort of a
Yeah, so
feel.
the CEO looks at my direct reports and their direct reports. So that level, it's pretty deep. And he spends a fair amount of time throughout the course of the year. As in Dolph's case, it's all a build towards that board presentation that we put together. In our case, it's in November. So he does get familiar with the names. What we try to own from the center is the design of the what. So what are they doing? I have a center of excellence, if you will, that tries to own the design of those programs, but the deployment of those programs, not the one I've been talking about, but others, are really into the business, into the regions, so that we can at least have some assurance that there's a consistent approach, a consistent value on what behaviors and competencies are we developing, and that's been
Makes sense.
fairly
Yeah.
successful.
All same sort of model.
Yeah, pretty much. And it's interesting. My challenge right now is actually within my own HR team. Because initially I had my HR leadership the Learning and Development Group, really responsible for owning that top talent group. And it didn't work. They weren't close enough to these people. So if I have someone sitting in Shanghai, they didn't know them well enough. And it just, I found it to be a very clumsy process to do all the things that we needed to do. So I've actually taken the ownership of that group out of their hands at some bit of tension. But that now is owned by our Talent Advisory Committee, which is the senior team. What I want the HR Learning and Development team to be focused on are those more sort of programmatic things that we want to do across the organization. That we could say, I can transport those to any place, any part of the globe, because the core principles are the same. But it's been an interesting pivot that we've had to make, because I just felt like we were slow to the mark, having my HR team try to manage because they were quote unquote experts, when in fact most of this was going to make a difference because of what was happening with their jobs or job changes that my team couldn't affect. And they weren't with them every day. They didn't know the value systems and the stuff that we're talking about. So it's been a bit of a change that we've made in the last year or so.
We had to do that. We had a paper exercise where on paper you knew all the people. That wasn't very helpful when it came to really filling a job and so we pulled it up. The corporation only cared about the top 1% of the population, period. Then we had a joint ownership of high potentials below that, and the rest was really local. But to your point, Mike, for efficiency and for expertise, you develop programs to get implemented, you have a consistent opportunity for development, but you don't do it.
It supports the cost pressure you get, you know. What it used to be that everyone was doing the same program slightly differently, and so the inherent cost spread across the organization was very high. The ability to pull that to the center, and as I talked about, budget things at the center, is more efficient, and we've been able to make that argument. The key is that consistent deployment so that you can be confident that it is consistent.
I think maybe as Mads or someone mentioned about language, having a common language around development and potential.
Exactly,
and
yes.
I mean, that's so important.
Yeah, I have a follow-up question for Sally about that. The Brazilian head was very good, but doesn't speak English.
Yes.
He cannot go to the next level.
Yes.
Wouldn't the corporate provide an opportunity for him to learn the language? Does he know that he has to do it, or it's his own problem, or his agenda?
It's at the point where we have provided multiple opportunities, and his decision is one similar to our speaker this morning. He's decided at his point in his career he's happy where he is.
Okay, take it to the broader level. If there are people who are very good outside the headquarters who don't speak the language, the English, then wouldn't that be a waste on the part of the corporate resources that you want to promote these people because of the language issue? We really have to have a good language strategy in that sense, don't you think?
You do. And I think what the corporation has an obligation to do is to offer the training, offer the opportunity to improve your language skills. And we're just using this as a small event, right? And we do massive amounts of training around language. If the person either does not want to or proves unable to have that ability, then it becomes a point where it is a blocker, like any other competency that becomes a blocker for the individual.
Yeah, we experience the same. And typically, if you take the sales organization, the sales reps and the region managers within a country are probably not as proficient or proficient at all in English. If they want to go above that, though, the expectation is there, the conversations are had. We spend a fair amount of money on English for the emerging market countries that we have. But to Sally's point, you do run into occasionally people who just say, you know what, I'm comfortable doing what I'm doing and I'm not going to go anywhere else. The organization loses a little bit, but there's only so much you can do in those cases.
Now that said, we've also done a lot to help people to understand that you need to accept less than perfect English skills.
Absolutely, yeah.
So we've done a lot on culture and cultural differences and a lot on teamwork among multicultural teams and so forth to make sure that the other side is also addressed so that there's an acceptance on the part of the rest of the organization too. It just comes at some, which is less than perfect skills, fine. No skills, difficult.
Dolph, any thoughts on the language issue or?
Yeah, we haven't had significant issues with that. I mean, certainly, I agree with Sally and Mike. All of those are, our intent is to provide folks opportunities. I think your point that I think is really important not to miss is, do they even know? That's our issue.
That it's important.
We have a lot of folks that I think I would argue that I'm not sure they don't know what's important to get to that next level. And I think that's one of the things that we do have a responsibility before, is to make sure that folks have an honest assessment of, this is what it takes to get for your aspirations to be met. And so we have to really focus on it.
Strategy. Yeah, so that's something that we ought to think about. On the other hand, just because someone is good at English doesn't mean that he's or she is very good.
Exactly, and that's
Right.
the counter of this one,
That
because
is, yeah.
oftentimes, some of our senior team thinks someone is very special because they have excellent English skills.
Yeah.
And they may be less special from a performance.
Yeah, but I think the bigger point in this one, and I think you're on something important, is organizations, I think Dolph hit it on the head, is you have to tell people the consequences of their choices when it comes to career. Some people don't want to move to Iowa to get a manufacturing experience. That's fine, but they may impede your progress. And Cog, who we all know, former head of HR at Colgate-Palmolive, used to sit people down and say, look, you can choose to do anything you want, but let me tell you what you need when I compare two people, and that person has done it and you haven't. So you make your choices, and and I think that's just the adult way of doing development, especially middle management, because they may not have a perspective how important that is. I think that was Dolph's point a little bit. It's our duty is also to let them know. Question?
So my question has to do with, so we've talked about people who have decided they don't want to rise above where they are, or they're not capable for whatever reason. And we've talked about the high performers who are shooting to the top, and as long as they keep the company's values and their performance, everything's great, right? Then you kind of alluded to the people who have the ambition, they want to move up, they want to be the high performer category, but they don't make the cut. How do you deal with the middle that are going to stay in the middle, and how do you manage expectations and keep them engaged in your company?
And we all have high potentials. GE, years ago, we used to call those people anchors. You want them to be just where they are and be happy. How do you deal with the quote-unquote anchors who you want to stay where they are and be really good at what they're doing? Sally?
Dolph and I agree.
Easy one.
Sally.
Not always an easy situation. To some extent, let me give you an example.
For sure.
For sure, okay? And that can be dealt with through creation of a specific ladder that allows for the financial rewards as the technical skill set goes up. And sometimes it is just time and job that eventually ends up with an accumulated
Or maturity curve. Yeah.
maturity curve, right? So some of it is resolved that way. To be honest, some of it is a counsel out conversation, which is your expectations or your ambitions and what we believe you can aspire to are different. And you'll have to accept that or decide that you're going to leave the organization, which is fine. I mean, turnover in an organization is fine. It's actually part of life, right?
Those are two good approaches. Alternative career or a little adult to adult. Mike? I'm sorry, go ahead,
I
Sally.
have one more thing
Sure.
that and it's maybe just me, I keep saying to the organization, look at your job today, look at your job 5 years ago. It's an entirely different job. It may be the same job title, and you're in the same place in the same location. So what we want you to do is continue to learn. Mm-hmm. And if that excites you, then then this is a good fit for you. And so you try to get an acceptance of the situation on the part of the employee. And I think part of that is job enhancement that does come from continuous learning and stretching individuals. Because I think most people do not want to come to work to be bored and doing the same thing forever.
For sure.
Okay.
You know, we don't just develop the high potentials. And so to your question, I mean, there is that group of, we call them highly valued, well-placed, you know, that need development. Sometimes the edges need to be rounded a little bit depending on what we ask them to do. So you do what we've talked about. There's programs, typically they're the ones that may participate in an external program, situational leadership, or some kind of program that you can take off the shelf to help them a little bit. There's developmental assignments that we could still put those folks on that we do, you know, because they bring a wealth of experience and knowledge that could help a project. And so they may be surrounded by others, but they participate. And then there's the dark side, if you will, that, you know, it's the career discussion that says your job has changed and unfortunately, you know, you don't have the skill set to be competitive anymore. I try to make those conversations about the competition because it's competitive out there. And so when you're looking across a skill set that a variety of candidates bring to a job, it's much easier for someone to articulate the differences in where the gaps might be. If you can help them fill those gaps, then we try to do that. If we can't, then they have to make that career decision.
Yeah, I'm not sure I could add really any more to what Sally and Mike have said. The one thing I would say, though, is that we're trying at Hasbro to make a pivot, again, with, I want to do away with performance appraisals, which I think a lot of people have talked about. We've heard that. And I'd like to get to a place where we're not doing formal appraisals as a company, because I just don't think they work. I don't think managers like doing them, and I don't think employees like getting them. I think the rating systems that we have today are archaic. I mean, I think certainly David has heard me talk about this at some length. We have a rating system where I talk about people, if you're meeting your targets, you're fully effective. And I'm not sure to call someone fully effective motivates anybody. I don't think anybody runs home and says to their spouse, let's go out to dinner because today I'm fully effective. I don't think that's the way fully formed adults work. Now, that means we don't want less communication, though. I want more communication. And so we've moved over the last 2 years to every quarter, every manager is responsible for having coaching sessions with their direct reports to cascade that down. So the idea that we have people that have, for whatever reason, they're not as curious, they don't have that intellectual curiosity that we want to push. The purpose of those coaching discussions is to say to this individual, listen, I don't want to come in tomorrow and say all of a sudden you don't have a job. I want to give you a long enough runway to understand that this organization is changing. And either you're going to keep ahead of that pace or you're not. Right now you're on track or you're not. But I'm not here today to say you got to make that change because tomorrow I'm going to take your job. We're trying to give people enough runway to recognize they've got to continue to grow. They've got to continue to be out ahead of the organization. And so we're trying to have more communication, more conversation, more dialogue, and move away from, I think, the archaic processes that actually hold us back. Because people wait till they get to the end of the year. They don't want to have this conversation, and the employee doesn't want to hear this conversation. And to try to tell this person in December, you should have done that in January, is a bit late.
So if you have these quarterly coaching conversations, are they recorded? Because I'm just thinking, how do you protect yourself legally?
We try to have some documentation.
That's the big dilemma.
Yes.
It is.
That's why you can't blow up some way to do it. Yeah.
Now, again, let me just, because, again, we have great conversations with my legal brethren over this. The thing that I would tell you is if we get to a place where someone is going to be termed because of all the reasons that Sally and Mike have discussed, we do start a performance plan. We just don't flip a switch. We do have some performance plan, whether it's 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, some time frame, just to make sure that we protected ourselves. But there is some documentation that we're trying to do with all of these, but we're not trying to over-formalize it either. So.
By the way, at Bristol Myers Squibb, we eliminated all performance ratings. You got one note once a year, and you had these coaching sessions. It was hard getting managers to do that, by the way. A lot of things got in the way. And about the legal issue, I got to tell you, just about everybody we fired and I opened their file, I wish we didn't have ratings. because most of them, either they got stupid overnight or someone was lying on the appraisal, because they all looked pretty good to me. And so we just wrote the check, when they left. But
I mean, we may be, we're probably behind the times, but we were just putting in a global system to be able to have written performance appraisals online for everybody. Okay?
good
And it
luck.
was a very interesting experiment, because for years I had been told by my HR folks, oh yeah, 100% of our folks have a sit-down conversation with their managers every year. Yep, at least once a year. And I'd go, okay, really? 100%? Yes, 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 yes. Well, we got to this written piece, and we had anywhere from, say, 80% to some organizations, 95% of people actually documented the conversation.
Yeah. Well, that was that earlier presentation where the first block was, mythical or mystical? Magical?
Yep.
Yeah, that's
Yep.
performance appraisal.
But
yeah.
what it did give us the opportunity to do was then to go read some of them to make sure that those situations where we knew that there was some potential for having to have a hard conversation around performance with someone, that the manager was actually documenting the truth, or what he was telling us in HR is the truth. So it does give you, something like that.
I think, Mark, you wanted to ask a question?
I did, and the panel has talked a lot about different ways, a lot of which are internally oriented, that you're developing your talent at various levels of the organization. And earlier there was also the mention of the word perspective, and I'm curious from some of my responsibilities. And also the comment was made about a little bit of a reduction in a business school in New Hampshire that maybe used less often.
That other
But
school.
does the panel still believe there's a purpose, and where and when in your organization, to engage a business school, executive education type programming?
And go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think when you look at our program that I've talked a little bit about, it's a partnership across the three pieces. So you have the internal arm, the Covidian folks that participate in the design. We partner with Babson for the academic piece of it, and they bring that external perspective as well. And then we have the Forum Corporation from the leadership consulting perspective. So it's a partnership that puts that curriculum together and then actually delivers the program. So we use faculty from Babson that bring the innovation and globalization perspective that they gain through, the work that they do in like the school here. So there's an absolute place for it. I think I was thinking that earlier when the discussion up here was about that. Yeah, there's absolutely a place. It's just going to be a balance, probably more blended. And it is a partnership. That's the thing that has struck me. It really, we call upon the faculty, and they've now been partners with us for several years. And it's very valuable to us as an organization as well.
But it's tailored to you?
It's tailored to the Covidian organization, yeah. But they speak to our industry and other industries, and they're able to help us.
Yeah. And, it's interesting, Paula and Mark and I were having an earlier discussion on some development, and Mark made the point was often it's having different companies represented in an executive education sort of forum where you learn from what others are doing. I think there's a benefit, obviously, of bringing something in and tailoring. I think there's an equal benefit of being able to participate in a learning with people from different companies, so you learn a little bit about how they do something differently. So you learn about yourself, and you can learn about others. By the way, I'm doing a time check. I think we have to end by 6:30.
You better feed us then.
Yeah. Actually, I think we're supposed to end at 5.
If I could just one thing that I would say is we are trying to actually develop not the individuals, and we will continue to use executive ed programs as appropriate for exactly what Charlie and Mike alluded to. We've moved away from Tuck because we felt like we've sort of taken that program as far as we can take it. What we're spending more time is how do you develop not individuals but teams. So we're spending time trying to put teams that we think are going to work together. For example, the team that might sit in the C-suite in the next 5 years. How do you put that team together now and start developing them over the next 3-4 years as a cohort? Looking for ways to put teams together as opposed to trying to do this loose confederacy of individuals, and hopefully that'll somehow come together.
That's a big idea.
We're trying to move away from that because I'm not sure that that's, as much as we spent with our relationship with Tuck, and I think the world of those folks, I'm not sure our depth of bench has fundamentally changed from that. They've done great stuff, but I'm not sure it's quite delivered on what we had hoped.
And that shared experience has got to help you longer term. Yeah. I will take one more question and then we're done.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I'm just wondering if we could just change an assumption. We've heard wonderful things about what we do to people,
Yeah.
be they middle, high potential, or whatever. What if we took the assumption, as in some other countries, where partners are in adversity, come together to work together and learn from each other? So be it action learning sets in the UK or maybe even the early days of quality circles in Japan, whatever. What if we took that assumption? I think you mentioned communities of practice that have been developed. Could we perhaps expand a little bit more on this? How are you encouraging them to share their problems and learn from each other, both internationally and nationally? That would be interesting to hear too, rather than,
Yeah.
I like what you said, but how about from bubbling up?
Well, you've had a
Partners
mix,
in
I think
diversity.
coming out was a mix of participants from different regions and things. I don't know if that's getting at it. Maybe. Ah, okay.
On the, right,
Okay.
communities of practice was certainly something that we've used, and primarily at the moment. I don't know what they've done since April, but we were pretty expansive in our engineering roles, and we were moving into our R&D type roles around the world. So, because the technical expertise sharing is a little easier to start, I think. What we have done, though, is we've put action learning teams together. I mean, it's a common way of working on, and specifically in cross-European teams or intra-European teams. And that's been pretty effective, too, from that standpoint. We also have market networks, so if people are participating in a particular market, there's a lot of work that happens that is problem-solving work that is among people holding similar roles in
Cross markets.
across different regions. So we've done a lot to network people.
Something very similar, cross-functional lines, the R&D groups get together, typically a couple times a year, marketing folks, sales folks, and it's best practice sharing, it's what problems are you dealing with, and, you know, one or two folks will step up as leaders of that group just to kind of get the discussion going. Typically not a robust agenda, it's much more about the informal. And we've had some things come from those discussions that have really helped our business.
Yeah.
I think also they have a deeper context of talking about their own behavior.
Sure.
As we heard from the first speaker today.
Right.
It's a good point.
By both business challenges and personal ones, to the behavior.
Yeah.
worked on as well.
Yeah. We did an extreme example of that. We bought a over-the-counter business, over-the-counter medicines in Europe, in Paris, in France, just outside Paris. And we had a very unsuccessful domestic over-the-counter business. You may have heard of Advil, which doesn't exist anymore. But, so we moved the headquarters of our over-the-counter business to the new acquisition, moved it out of the United States to learn from them. And actually, we saw it was beneficial, for sure. Yeah. I think we're kind of at the end of our session. This has been tremendous. I really appreciate you all sharing your experiences and great questions. So thank you very much.
Thank you.